Greetings and welcome. Today we're turning to a really key question, and that's the question, what are some of the sources of organizational failure in the production of large-scale technology accidents and other kinds of consequential failures within our complex society? We've seen a recurring theme in the cases that we've considered as well as the analysis that we've offered of those cases, and that has to do with organizational dysfunction. And today we'll be looking at organizational dysfunction both in corporate organizations and the owners and managers of complex processes, but also governmental dysfunction and the only partial ability of government regulatory agencies to appropriately oversee the complex technologies which they are responsible for. And the kinds of organizational dysfunctions that we're discussing today and for the next couple of sessions, those dysfunctions are kind of neutral across business organizations and governmental organizations. I lump this topic together under a general topic of social ontology of government, which is the reason I asked you to read some excerpts, a couple of chapters from my book, A New Social Ontology of Government. But the approach which I take there is to look at the ways in which government organizations work, what the underlying mechanisms and actions are that constitute the actions of government organizations, and how we can see that some of those features of action, features of organization, can lead to various kinds of failure. So what is an organization, whether it's a firm, a corporation, or a government agency? Most generally, we can say an organization is a meso-level social entity. It is composed of actors in roles embedded within a set of roles, a set of norms, a set of incentive systems, and a set of opportunities. It consists of a variety of designed operations, interactions between individuals with one set of tasks and another set of individuals with a different set of tasks. And also, organizations invariably have some kind of control mechanisms which are designed to establish compliance of organizational actors with organizational directives. Another important recognition, especially in contemporary organizational sociology, is that we need to understand organizations within the larger social context and social structures in which they exist, whether it's a larger system of government, or it's a system of regulation for a corporation, or it's business competitors and the market forces which a corporation is forced to reckon with, or it may be demographic facts about consumer patterns for the goods which a company is producing. So we might say then that an organization is composed of norms, rules, procedures, and roles which guide and constrain the behavior of actors within the organization. Another important finding of organizational sociology and the study of government, certainly one of the central discoveries I feel that comes out of my own book, The New Social Ontology of Government, is the fact that government actions and processes are disaggregated over multiple actors. Government is not a single unitary process. Instead, it is multiple processes disaggregated over units and agencies and bureaus, and that there is a great deal of, not always tension, but at least separation between the units of action within a government. Governments are involved in belief gathering and assessment, so the EPA unavoidably gathers information and scientific assessment of the risks and benefits of various potential sources of environmental health. Government agencies are involved in policy writing and adoption of policy. Government agencies are involved in enforcement and compliance activities. But this heterogeneity, which I'm calling your attention to, heterogeneity of actions and units of action within government, leads to several items which are potentially dysfunctional almost from the start. There is the possibility of the overlap, interference, and inconsistency across multiple offices or bureaus within a government. And furthermore, the idealized view that all of government ultimately reports to a super executive, whether it's a cabinet minister for the Department of Justice or it's the President of the United States, the idea that there is a super executive who is imposing a perfectly logical order on this process, that is certainly mythological. It is certainly not possible for any large, complex organization like a government organization with hundreds of thousands of employees to be organized by a single super executive. Instead, these internal processes of management, direction setting, priority setting, and internal monitoring attempt to guide the actions of this multi-unit process. We could look at this as another instance of loose coupling, which we've talked about previously, the idea that there are multiple entities or sub-units within an organization or within a factory which are only loosely coupled together, and therefore their actions may sometimes be inconsistent. So what are some of the features which affect organizational performance? Organizational sociology has identified a handful of factors, and it is an interesting question. How do we empirically validate the idea that this factor or that factor is associated with organizational performance? I won't go into that question just now, but it is an important question. But it's generally agreed that quality of leadership and supervision is an important feature of organizational performance. Effectiveness of collaboration within and across units is clearly important. No single unit is able to accomplish the organization's overall goals with respect to some outcome, and therefore securing collaboration across units and even within units is crucially important. And if collaboration is not easy to attain, then the functioning of the organization is likely to be impaired. A related point has to do with internal communication, and we'll see in our study of the nuclear plant in Ohio shortly that internal communication and communication between the NRC and FirstEnergy was very poor, but quality of internal communication and coordination about plans, actions, and intentions is a feature which can either make organizational performance better or can impair organizational functioning. And then another factor, I'm sure there are dozens of other factors that you could think of, and maybe we'll think of them during some discussion, but the degree to which an organization is consistent or inconsistent in the establishment of unit priorities and plans. This clearly can affect the effectiveness of the organization overall. If there is substantial inconsistency between the manufacturing division of a major auto plant and the marketing division of the plant, then we could imagine that overall the company is not going to be as successful at selling cars. So what are some of the underlying features of dysfunction which can be identified, given now that we have sort of a conception of what kind of social entity an organization is? The thing which seems the most important to me, the idea or the feature of social life which seems most important, is what political scientists refer to as a principal-agent problem. The fact that social organizations, corporations, firms, government agencies are constituted by the actors who play roles within the organization, this feature of the ontology of an organization immediately gives rise to the possibility of a principal-agent problem. And here's the way that I define a principal-agent problem. I'm simply paraphrasing the real experts on this topic, but here's a definition. A principal-agent problem is a situation in which an authority, the principal, instructs the subordinate, the agent, to complete a task, but where the principal has limited ability to monitor and supervise the agent's performance. And we could describe this as a problem of incomplete or imperfect information over time concerning performance and compliance. So if a research team is given the overall task of discovering, a treatment to COVID, and the research team is, let's say, given a grant of $10 million to do exploratory research on a certain kind of treatment for the disease, And instead, their director gets really interested in the biochemistry of part of the process, and the team is diverted from looking for a treatment to looking for the fundamental biochemistry. Well, that would be an instance, not necessarily a terribly toxic instance, but an instance of a principal agent problem. The team was commissioned to do one thing, and it deviated from pursuing that goal. A second major, kind of now familiar concept to us is loose coupling. And this refers to the idea that there is often an imperfect ability to control and coordinate activity within a unit and between two units. So the enforcement division of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission may be only imperfectly connected to the reactor safety division of the NRC. Again, a kind of explanatory paragraph from the readings that you did. Tightly coupled groups of organizations have a high level of coordination, dense communication, protocols establishing authority relations and terms of cooperation, and established relationships among personnel in both organizations. This is what's referred to as a tightly coupled organization or a set of organizations. But loose coupling is probably a more common feature of all large organizations, both in government and in the corporate and private worlds. Conflict of interest is another social feature which I think we can all identify, and yet which is frequently, maybe always, involved in dysfunction, organizational dysfunction. So the idea here is that a conflict of interest is a situation in which the actor within an organization has private reasons for acting in one way, whereas her corporate and organizational responsibilities require that she act in a different way. Quoting from Dennis Thompson, an expert at the Kennedy School at Harvard, a conflict of interest is a set of conditions in which professional judgment concerning a primary interest, such as patients' welfare or the validity of research, tends to be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, such as financial gain. That's Dennis Thompson. Conflict of interest within an organization can take many forms. Direct financial conflicts, where physicians and researchers within a medical unit have a personal financial interest in, let's say, a diagnostic company or the equipment that's used for diagnostic tests. That would be an example of financial conflicts. But they may be personal conflicts. It may be that an individual has an interest in favoring a particular group, for example, in hiring. Whereas the organization's interest is hiring the best people and also honoring the requirements of equal opportunity, but the personal commitment of the hiring manager is in conflict with that institutional goal. An individual may have career objectives which conflict with his or her organizational responsibilities. So you could think of an instance where a general in the Army or a vice president in a corporation each have a clear responsibility to carry out an instruction or a strategic objective, but also recognize that failure in that objective may lead to serious damage to career objectives, career ambitions, and therefore may slow walk the strategic objective. That would be an example of a conflict of interest which is coming out of career objectives in conflict with the organization's fundamental priorities and strategic goals. But conflict of interest doesn't necessarily have to be kind of narrowly self-interested. We can think of a situation where even moral and religious commitments can give rise to conflicts of interest. Now, each of the kinds of failure which I've highlighted so far are failures of performance or failures of conformance of an actor within an organization with the role, responsibilities, or the directives which he or she has received within the organization. And of course, these are kind of obvious. It's kind of obvious that there are sometimes incentives to behave contrary to either what one's instructions are or what the goals and patterns of behavior are that are associated with one's role. That sort of lack of compliance is obvious also to the organizers of organizations. And therefore, organizations have methods for enhancing accountability and compliance. The idea of simply instructing individuals within an organization, go out and do your best, that is probably not an overall satisfactory way of organizing activity within an organization. Instead, there needs to be supervision, there needs to be an accounting function, an audit function, a way of, as President Reagan said of the Soviet Union many years ago, trust but verify. And so standards of accountability, accounting, and audit are familiar organizational mechanisms for trying to reduce principal agent problems, conflicts of interest, and so forth. And so organizational designers make efforts to mitigate against these kinds of deviations between what the organization expects in terms of behavior and what the individual actors are actually providing. But one thing which has been emphasized by contemporary organizational sociologists is that there's a limit to the ability of kind of punitive, oversight, regulative measures, and that it is also important to have ways of motivating individual actors internally as well as externally. So we can distinguish between internal sources of motivation and external sources of motivation. External would be, I don't want to get in trouble with the accountants and the audit function. Internal would be, I want to do the best job I can in my function because I believe in the mission of the organization and I know what my role is. Here's a passage that I wanted to draw your attention to from the readings, quoting from the text. The application to government action, agency, and decision-making is straightforward. Policymakers need to be aware of the dysfunctions that are always lurking in the intricacies of organizations, and to take steps to minimize their negative consequences. This means that regulatory agencies need to ensure adequate and independent inspection of facilities. Advisory panels need to take steps to avoid conflicts of interest in its expert advisors, and legislators need to write legislation mindful of the distorting effects of industry advocacy. Let's turn now to the Davis-Besse nuclear plant accident of 2002. It's an interesting accident because by some descriptions it is the second worst nuclear accident we've had in this country, in spite of the fact that it was a near miss, not an actual accident. It's interesting for our purposes because the primary source, which I'm asking you to read, is a government accountability organization, a GAO report on the adequacy of Nuclear Regulatory Commission oversight over FirstEnergy and the management and oversight of this particular plant. So what is the plant? Davis-Besse plant is an 800 megawatt nuclear plant between Cleveland and Toledo in Ohio, in other words, within about 100 miles of Ann Arbor, owned by a company called FirstEnergy. In 2002, it was a near miss for a loss of coolant accident caused by extensive and undetected corrosion of the reactor dome. This was a chilling accident, or near accident. The cause of the corrosion was leakage of boric acid-laced coolant water. The NRC was aware of the hazard created by boric acid in nuclear plants because of the rapid corrosion of stainless steel plumbing that boric acid can create and observed effects in other plants. NRC had issued warnings to plants about boric acid corrosion, and when risk assessment increased, it ordered full inspections. FirstEnergy was able to delay inspection of its facility at Davis-Besse until a point in time closer to routine shutdown for maintenance and refueling. And this is a point that we have seen repeatedly in accidents. This is a production pressure and a business pressure reason for delaying a safety event. FirstEnergy wanted to avoid the cost and possibly the inconvenience to consumers of shutting down this plant prematurely. But upon inspection, a pineapple-sized cavity was discovered in the reactor vessel head. And what the inspection revealed really was that the vessel head was dangerously close to losing integrity. In other words, to bursting and to releasing large amounts of material. As I say, boric acid corrosion was well known, well understood, and an increasing problem in aging plants. And here's a quote from the GAO report. Had this lining given way, the water within the reactor vessel would have escaped, triggering a loss of coolant accident, which, if backup systems had failed to operate, likely would have resulted in the melting of the radioactive core and a subsequent release of radioactive materials into the environment. This is the chilling possibility, and GAO regarded this possibility not as a merely hypothetical possibility, but as a real probable risk. So GAO was requested by members of Congress to perform an investigation of the actions of the NRC leading to this near miss, including the decision to delay the inspection by 6 to 9 months. And GAO was highly critical of NRC, but critical also of the behavior of NextEnergy. This is also interesting for us because it's, in one sense, it's encouraging of our confidence in the ability of government to oversee safety risks. The NRC was not the only government agency which was able to have a voice in this accident. GAO was also able to have an influential voice, and its feedback to NRC provided Congress with some reasons to consider organizational change at NRC. Unfortunately, that imperative was not especially effective, but it's at least interesting and affirming that GAO was an independent agency which came to some pretty rigorous conclusions about NRC's effectiveness. GAO found NRC had been ineffective in assessing NextEnergy's request for a delay of shutdown, ineffective at communicating the risks associated with boric acid erosion, and ineffective in mounting and implementing its program of inspection. It faulted NRC for excessive reliance on self-reporting and self-regulation by the owner, another issue which we've talked about a little bit previously, but this is really called out in the Davis-Besse case. A very specific issue comes up in the GAO report, which I think is interesting for our purposes. The NRC and also the industry use a computational method called probabilistic risk assessment to determine what risks and what scenarios of failure should be given the highest priority. So PRA assessment is a methodology for assessing risk of various kinds of accidents. And in this instance, the GAO reports that that NRC and NextEnergy had used a PRA assessment to come to the conclusion that boric acid erosion was not a serious high-level source of risk for a loss of coolant accident at Davis-Besse, quoting from the report. For example, but the important thing here is the GAO took the specific analysis which was done by NRC and NextEnergy and asked a team of highly qualified nuclear engineers from the academic world, including an engineer from the Department of Nuclear Engineering at the University of Michigan, and asked them to review the assessment, the PRA assessment, which was done. And here is a summary. For example, the consultants concluded that NRC's estimate of risk was incorrectly too small, primarily because the calculation did not consider corrosion of the vessel head, which was the primary problem. In reviewing how NRC developed and used its PRA estimates for Davis-Besse, our consultants noted that the calculated risk was smaller than it should have been because the calculation did not consider corrosion of the reactor vessel from the boric acid coolant leaking through cracks in the nozzles. And the primary reason for that was an incorrect kind of physics/chemistry assumption that whatever leakage occurred would be small and it would immediately flash to steam, leaving the boric acid in a non-corrosive dry state. And that turned out to be false. That assumption turned out to be false. NRC also found multiple sources of inspection failure had occurred prior to the shutdown to correct the corrosion, which was in the end discovered, that inadequate information was provided to the inspectors, the resident inspectors at the plant, about the technical hazards of boric acid corrosion. Basically, they were not given clear and convincing information that showed how serious a hazard boric acid corrosion was. Secondly, that there was insufficient inspection resources which were made available to do adequate inspections. So basically, there was not enough inspection time available to do the inspections that were necessary in order to ensure safety. And then finally, inspectors' reports were sometimes disregarded or given low priority by the operators, and that's a FirstEnergy failure. Communications failures were also identified. I'll just read one of these quotes. Similarly, NRC officials said that NRC headquarters had no systematic process for communicating information, such as on boric acid corrosion, cracking, and small amounts of unidentified leakage that had not yet risen to a relatively high level of concern within the agency in a timely manner to its regions or on-site inspectors. That's a communications issue. If a low, remember in the conversation that we had about managing the unexpected, the aphorism, small warnings should sometimes lead to large responses. Essentially, what this criticism is saying is that there was a small warning about corrosion, kind of small levels of corrosion associated with small levels of leakage, that should have triggered a much larger concern for larger corrosion and much more serious accident potential. Resource constraints, this is another concern raised by the GAO report. Positions, inspector positions were left unfilled, and furthermore, there were limitations. As a result of this resource limitations on the capacity of the resident inspectors to fully inspect plant operations. Now, of course, a plant is an insanely complex ensemble of activities and processes and so forth, and so some way of ranking priorities of inspection must be maintained, but GAO is clearly saying there were areas of serious risk which the inspection regime was unable to address. They also draw out the point that there was a degraded safety culture at FirstEnergy. They found severe faults in the safety culture and commitment to safe operations embodied in FirstEnergy management, and they believe that NRC should have been aware of this failure as well. They draw attention to the production pressure and the industry pressure which seems to underlie the decision to delay closing the plant for a full inspection of the reactor containment vessel, and make it fairly clear that it was industry pressure, it was FirstEnergy's ability to pressure the agency which led to the decision to allow the delay. FirstEnergy is not the primary target of this investigation, but it certainly comes in for criticism, and FirstEnergy is faulted for having an imbalance between production and safety, its failure to address symptoms rather than causes. It's the fact that it addressed symptoms rather than causes, simply cleaning up boric acid deposits rather than seeking out what the sources of these boric acid deposits were. There was also a lack of management involvement in oversight of work at the Davis-Besse plant, which was crucial for maintaining safety. There was a lack of a questioning attitude, again, a kind of management responsibility according to the high reliability organization work that we've read. The idea that top management should be hands-on involved in operational matters. The GAO report faults FirstEnergy managers for failure to take direct kind of involvement and expertise in the inspection process, that there was ineffective, untimely corrective action, and there was a long-standing acceptance of degraded equipment. They also fault the tendency of the company to increasingly permit a kind of a degradation of engineering rigor in maintenance of the plant. It's almost an instance of the normalization of deviance, which we saw in Diane Vaughan, but the idea that, okay, this plant has been operating for decades and apparently we're doing okay, and so more engineering attention is really not needed. So the GAO report is not optimistic that the NRC has addressed the root causes of its regulatory and operating failures. This is a very interesting and very damning report, concluding paragraph, which I won't read. But I will conclude by referring to Chick Perrow's analysis of regulatory failures in the other article that you read, Cracks in the Regulatory System. His view is even broader. His view is that the American governmental approach to regulation and deregulation has led to what he refers to as a deregulated state and deregulated capitalism or deregulated business activity. He writes that government assumes a coordinating rather than a directive role in this account as regulators draw upon industry best practices, its standard-setting proclamations, and encourage self-monitoring, which we saw exactly in the GAO report. He notes a failure of firms to select truly independent inspectors. Again, we see that in the GAO report. And almost every major industrial accident in recent times has involved either regulatory failure or the deregulation demanded by business and industry. These are damning points by Perrow, and as we all have come to recognize, Perrow has a fairly pessimistic view of our ability to manage complex technology systems. But frankly, it does seem to me that this article is very hard to refute. We have lived through 30, 40 years of deregulation, the idea that private industry can do the best job of regulating its activities, and yet Perrow draws attention to the many, many cases where that confidence in private companies' ability or even incentive to monitor their own practices in a safe and reliable way is very limited.